similarly dates back to the beginnings of human communication. And these two cultures take all of these pieces, and they don't just combine them, they push them ahead, they recombine, and they continually reinvent themselves. Hip-hop and comics have grown from modest origins to achieve global dominance. They drive our popular culture. They take in new input, and as they do, they encompass more viewpoints and become truly universal forms of communication and art. They're not just about combination, but inclusion. They inspire passionate fan bases, as evidenced at any hip-hop show and by conventions like this one. They thrive on participation and mean different things to different people. There's room for everyone in the communities that they create. So today I'm proud to present an awesomely eclectic group of creators and artists who use these forms in their own life and work. And I'm going to go down the line and introduce them really quickly. Down at the end, Erin Yu, she's a muralist, street artist, and activist, community organizer. She's part of the Few and Far Collective and the Trust Your Struggle Collective. She's the executive director of the Estria Foundation, who hosts the Estria Battle, a national graffiti competition. Erin Yu. Next in line, Flo. Fine artist, native of Mexico, now based in San Diego. Her work has a strong comic and animation influence. She's a graphic designer. She's a muralist. She'll paint pretty much anything and make it into her own. So, Flo. Kenny Keel came to my attention and probably most of the hip-hop world's attention when he created some years ago the pieces that were collected in my long box weighs a ton, mashups of superheroes and classic rap album covers. He's the creator of Rhyme Travelers, an ongoing all-ages hip-hop series. He's a cartoonist for Mad Magazine. He does a lot of amazing work, and hip-hop is really at the heart and soul of pretty much everything he does. Kenny Keel. James Bertano is the founder of TFU Studios. You may know his work from the Mad Villainy video and comic insert. He's done work with Ms. Marquis, with Santa Cruz Skateboards. He has his own series called 1985, which traces the evolution of hip-hop in a small beachside California community and his own role in sort of finding himself through hip-hop. James Bertano. DJ Newmark, member of Jurassic 5, turntablist, producer, and DJ extraordinaire. His new album is called Broken Sunlight. He's currently on tour with Jurassic 5 and also as a solo artist. He just did the music for Ride Along, the Ice Cube film, as well as most of the music for Sony's Battle of the Year, a new breakdancing film. And he's currently working on an album with Slim Kid Trey from the Far Side, DJ Newmark. And lastly, Ted Lange. One of the great things about these conventions is that every time I go to one, I find some new creator that is working in these forms that I love, that I've previously been unaware of. I was at Emerald City Comic Con a couple weeks ago, and after going through Artist Alley, I came out with like 5 new amazing hip-hop comics that I'd never heard of before by creators that I'd just been introduced to. Today, I was going through Artist Alley downstairs and discovered Ted's work. He is the creator of Warp Zone. It's just been released as his debut comic book. He's a sketch comedian by trade, moved between Los Angeles and Brooklyn. He's now based out here and creating comics with a strong graffiti and animation influence. Ted Lange. Now that I've gotten through all those introductions, let's get in with it. So, I guess the first question for everyone is, these forms, hip-hop and comics. I talked a lot just now about what they mean to me and why I'm drawn to them. But what was your first exposure to these forms? What inspired you to sort of join in and become a participant in these cultures? And I guess I'll start with Kenny and James, because James, your work speaks directly to this. And you guys work in similar formats. So start with you guys.
Kenny, you want to take this?
Put me on the spot. Yeah, okay, sure.
If you don't, I'll keep talking. So.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Patrick outlined a lot of reasons, and there are definitely multitudes. But I think for me personally, it just came down to stories. I just love stories. So, you know, the hip hop artists I would kind of gravitate towards this most strongly would be your sort of Slick Ricks, B.I.G., just these guys who had a charisma and a creativity where, with just their voice, they could pretty much take you anywhere they wanted to take you through a narrative. And the same is true for comics. A dope artist just needs a pen. He'll take you to outer space, and he'll take you to a crime story. You know, James will take you to 1985. Like, it's just always what kind of drew me into it, on top of, you know, the larger-than-life personas, the characters, the aliases, the costumes, all that pageantry and sort of mythologizing. But yeah, it always comes down to stories for me.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I mean, I think that as a kid, I collected comics first, so that was like my first introduction. But then seeing graffiti it reminded me a lot of the logos that were on the comics. Like if you saw the name of the thing, or you saw something like X-Men that looked almost like, when I saw the graffiti, I thought, wow, it's almost like the same sort of thing. So it was really, for me, an attraction to letters. And that's always what graffiti has always meant to me, is just letters. And then I think through graffiti, I got really hip hop and everything else. But they kind of keep, those two elements keep kind of colliding in my life. And I think by the time I quit graffiti in my early 20s, but I remember thinking like, well, I still love this, and I've always been fascinated with what do graffiti writers do when they retire? What do they do when they stop? Or they get a job or anything else. So I just love the idea of where to take it from, and I've taken it to animation and graphic arts and stuff. And that spirit is still there, that competition, which is very important in graffiti, is still there. And yeah, that's, and comics are still a passion of mine, so it's a perfect melding of the two worlds.
Ted, what about you? You're the other comic creator on this panel.
Well, I've always loved comics.
You know, I mean, sorry.
I've always loved comics and like always read them. It's like I started with like Secret Wars back in the day, like the 80s, and then I've always loved hip hop. Like that's just kind of like what I grew up with. So it's kind of like in the fiber of my being, I feel like, you know. And for me, it kind of started with, as far as hip hop, Tribe Called Quest, what kind of is what set it off. And I think for me, I can sort of see the parallels, like it kind of mimicked comics in a way, not mimicked, but it related in like, in Marvel, they had like Marvel Team Up, and like on Tribe albums, you'd have like Black Sheep or like Busta Rhymes, like everybody would always be, I don't know, they're like a super group, you know? And I think that was a big influence on me. Also, I think something that really inspired me in college was Deltron 3030. Just like, I don't know if anybody's, it's an awesome album. It's like,
we did a panel with them in San Diego this year.
Oh wow, I wish I could have been there. That's like, that changed my life, dude. That's an awesome album. It's instead of dude rapping about like selling rocks or whatever, he's rapping about stealing like mech suits and like going to intergalactic rap battles. Like it's an awesome album. So I think that's a lot of that stuff that really informs my work personally. You know, it's a huge influence.
Okay, jumping disciplines for a minute. I guess Glow and Aaron, what like brought you into the world of graffiti? And yeah, either or both.
All right, well, for me it was like opposite, because I think I was into cartoons first, and then I saw a comic about superheroes, and I was like, oh my God, really? This is how it like comes back? So I wanted to be an illustrator or a comic artist. And then I started growing up and wanted to go into fine art. So I went to fine art and got invited to paint walls. So it was completely opposite. And then I got, introduced into hip hop. So it's weird. And then you meet a lot of people that got hip hop in their souls because they do graffiti and they do letters. And it's amazing just to listen to what Yoshi has to say for himself.
Yeah, so I guess I started with comics when I was a kid. It was kind of the first medium I started drawing. my mother was an artist and an illustrator, so we used to roll butcher paper across the floor and create characters, and then we would like really narrate a whole story. Like in your character, you'd redraw it down the whole like living room. So I think I kind of grew up with just that drawing inspiration of wanting to tell stories and wanting to create, these alternate worlds that I can imagine. But hip hop similarly, like I just grew up listening to it. I grew up here in LA, and there were so many groups that just influenced me, track for sure. I kind of was really into NWA and stuff growing up more, and then as I got older, it was more like Far Side, and I really loved them because they just had this comical way of telling stories, and it felt like through all the drama that you go through in your life, it was kind of escapism, or I could hear stories that I could relate to. So I think similarly with graph, it was just my outlet. It was just a way that I could express myself to the world and say that I'm here and this is what I have to say, as a young person. So I used to run around and do much more illegal stuff when I was a kid. And then I kind of took some years off of that and went more studio painting. And then as I've gotten older, I've gotten really back into it. And much more muralism and street art that I really love now.
So that's where graffiti artists go sometimes.
Yeah.
I go to another route because
That's.
you need to evolve as an artist.
I find it really fascinating that you guys have all brought up storytelling, because generally when people speak of either comics or hip hop, they don't necessarily go to that depth first. Like the first thing people hear when they walk by, or when like a car goes by, you don't hear the lyrics, you hear the beat. People are initially usually drawn to comics not from the depth of stories, but the first thing they see is this amazing, colorful explosion. And I think it's really fascinating that so many people here immediately gravitated, they jumped past that first level. Obviously you're going to see the colorful thing on the stands, but picking it up and getting drawn in and really internalizing it, which is a good transition to Mark. And with music, there's always a question. I've worked with a lot of producers before, and I've never quite figured out how to phrase this correctly. How do you internalize those influences and bring them back in a non-verbal, less literal way? What? And again, the earlier question, your influences, but.
Yeah, well, for me, the first thing that caught my eye about with comics was, I collected comics right when I started collecting records, so they were kind of side by side, and then I tried to draw, and I quickly realized that my ears were much better than my eyes, and my dexterity when it came to drawing, and continued playing drums and DJing and collecting records. But to answer your question, I think is the exaggeration factor that was involved in comics really played a big part in not just my life, but I think in a lot of producers and a lot of MCs in hip hop. That even when you look at the movie Superman, they had that long echo of shout behind the words. That exaggerated look can tie into the braggadocious MCs and the way they approach their lyrics. Beats in the 80s, especially when hip hop started to get some light, had really long kick drums, a lot of echo on it. Everything was long and drawn out, and even flyers for those jams try to mimic some sort of comic book atmosphere,
Yeah, right down to Grandmaster Flash, stuttering the Flash.
The whole buddy, I was gonna, I actually wrote that down. Flash Gordon sample.
There we go.
Anyway, this is much cooler than the panel that was here before, I can tell you that right now. They were talking about Baroque punk rock outfits. They just went way over my head. And I'm a nerd, trust me, I'm a nerd. Yeah, I guess that answered what you were saying. The whole flexing thing, when Run DMC came in the game, the 808 was introduced in the 80s. It was that long, powerful, exaggerated thing that I related to as a producer, and that's kind of how I translated the comic book thing into beats.
Excellent. For adapting a superheroic identity, as is common with most hip-hop artists, I asked Charlie Tuna at Wondercon last year about this, and his answer was just like, my uncle called me Charlie Tuna. It wasn't really an identity.
Thought-provoking Charlie.
Yeah, it was fantastic, but when you're creating this sort of performance alter ego, was there anything in particular that you were drawing inspiration from for that, or?
In my name,
Just
personally, or you think on a whole, you think, are you asking me what that they went deeper with it? Or?
I'm asking you personally. I mean, obviously, I know the roots of your specific name, but
my story was really corny actually, because I was DJing on a new Murk mixer. My name's Mark, and my DJ partner was like, you'll find a name, man. It's probably right underneath your nose. And I looked down, and it was a new Murk mixer. It was like literally that corny. Laziest DJ. Yeah. It's just like, and then and now they make some of the shittiest product known to man, and I'm stuck with the name, but.
But it's a bit late to change to DJ Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, what am I going to do now? So, no, I could have been much more creative, but I love how a lot of MCs, like Wu-Tang, with Ghostface doing the whole Iron Man thing, and they have the aliases, and, even just having the word man in your name is cool. Red Man, like, it just sounds dope. Like, I don't know, there's a level of flexing in there that just feels powerful,
Okay, then I guess back to Aaron Lowe. In creating a graffiti alter ego, was there a reason that Glow became the one that you chose, and was there a reason that you specifically stuck with Aaron as your name?
Well, I go by Yoshi, but
Okay.
Aaron Yoshi, but I usually write Yoshi. I changed names a bunch because I was trying to figure out, I need a name and it's got to fit. And I think when I was a kid, I wrote Solo, and then I wrote Charm when I was in high school through college-ish. And people started calling me Charm, and then I couldn't respond because I wasn't used to hearing it, and I thought that was weird and it didn't really work. And I ended up going back to Yoshi, which is what I was called as a kid, because my last name is a derivative of that. And so it's that just was almost natural, and it just started flowing, and I think I started owning it after a while. It kind of represents my culture, where I'm from, and then also just me of who I've been my whole life, so kind of stuff.
I like Charm, it's dope. It works. It's time for you to go back now.
I need to change your name now to Charm.
Okay.
I need a DJ name. How about Charm?
Need a Sharpie?
There you go.
I'll make a Charm of the Yoshi.
And for Glow, is there any particular?
My name is Gloria, and my friends that are I don't know, maybe they're lazy, they started to just call me, hey, Glow, Glow, Glow. And I already had it before I started doing walls, so the guys or friends who I collaborate with yo, you need to have some kind of name, a street art name, or what my friends call me. That's perfect, there are no glows anywhere, okay, write it down, dude, so I was all right, perfect. So that went pretty natural, too.
That's pretty fortuitous. In my experience, it's much better to have a name that is not 27 letters. In my very limited graffiti experience,
Right?
DJ Pat.
Right?
yeah,
DJ
you
Pat.
can very quickly narrow it down.
One syllable, those are the best graffiti names that I have ever encountered. So I'm not biased because my name is James.
Plus, you got to get it up really quick before someone catches you, One syllable, boom.
Faster, yeah. If you're doing illegal stuff, you have to have a short name.
A quasi-legal.
I have a question. As graph writers, I don't know if you're old enough to remember the days of flicks, of having pictures, photos of each other. I know that as a graffiti writer and a comic collector and a record collector myself, there's a form of completism that is, I don't know if it's a mental illness or not, but there's this form of well, I need to get them all. And I think that with graffiti, having the photos back before the internet, that was the only record that you ever had in an album. And those photos were gold. And I'd say, I'll trade you that Arab photo for 2 mirror photos. And it would be this black market. Do you guys remember ever doing that? Or?
Yeah. There have been times where I've thrown some events with Jim Furdoff, and he has such a beautiful collection of graffiti, photographer, collector, and going through some of his photos and seeing all the different generations of writers, and just looking at It is. It's like trading cards, like baseball
Yeah.
cards. I'm like, how do I get that one?
Yeah, there's definitely that collector mentality. Something you said about collecting records and comics. James touched on this in 1985. Like, every town that I went to had a record and comic shop. And there were like, they were things that you would dig through similarly in boxes of dusty stuff, and you find something that struck your attention for whatever reason, take it home and read it or listen to it. And about 10% of the time it was solid gold. About 90% of the time it was maybe something that you could use, or like, oh, okay, there's a guest appearance on this record or a guest appearance in this comic that I kind of care about.
Yeah, I found all my Fat Albert records in a comic book store, and one of them is worth a lot of money right now, and it's sampled tons. Yeah, no, usually if you can combine a bookstore and a record store, that's gold.
Yeah, there was that collecting mentality, and again, the tracing the guest appearance of this rap artist, like, oh, wait, Jay-Z first appeared on this thing? What? I guess I'll track down the Jazzo record, fine. Or Wolverine appearing in the back of Hulk is sort of the shortcut reference point for every comic fan. Ted, Kenny, James, I'm gonna fire.
Discover anything. It was already everywhere. So like, I mean, I can think about reading, any kind of Marvel comic where there'd be like graffiti, like a city street. There's always an alley. There's always like, the gang kind of looks like back up the enters in Thriller or something. And then there's like some random graffiti on the wall in the alley, like little clues like that, Yeah, and then like definitely that album cover. Like when I start going to record stores and see stuff like that, and it would just be like, pow, like what? People are putting this stuff together. I still geek out. Like when I see like, I'm trying to think of the last time I saw one, but yeah, anytime I see an album cover that has comic art on it, it still feels like the first time. I'm just like such a geek about it.
There's a bunch there. There's Soulsonic Force. There's Loop Pack.
Yeah.
Did that.
Yeah.
Mantronics.
I'm not sure.
Well, there's all the Bill Sienkiewicz things. There's the there's the Texera Public Enemy Music in Our Message.
Sure.
Like more and more comic artists towards the end of the '80s started getting work as cover designers.
Chill Out, Cool Chip.
No,
That one.
Chill Out and Cool Chip.
Yeah.
Every Kubert record ever made.
That is true. Yeah. There's a lot of those, and it's equally interesting, since you were mentioning in comics, looking through Marvel Comics, in '82, there's some graffiti in the background.
Yeah.
By like '85, they introduced, Wolfpack, which is, if you've ever seen it, Kyle Baker inked it. I don't remember who drew it. It is the cheesiest comic ever. It's like the band of street gangs in the Bronx that's like half warriors, half hip hop. But there's a page in there where they're having a house party and like there's Run DMC lyrics across the page. And I was like, oh, really? And then you get to the end of the '80s and you have the Kid and Play comic, and by the mid-'90s, Onyx had their own Marvel comic,
Yeah.
which was only one issue, thankfully.
There was
But
like a KRS.
there was the KRS Kyle Baker comic, Break the Chain.
Yeah.
So we're kind of, sorry, Ted.
I was looking back to the Bizarre Ride to the Far Side. That album cover was pretty iconic for me in the style, very sort of graffiti influenced,
Yeah.
Also, like, I'm a big fan of that movie Style Wars that kind of chronicles a lot of the graffiti and hip hop coming up in the 70s and 80s. And there's a lot of comic influence in those pieces. You see a lot of like Vaughn Bodie, Frank Rosetta, like a lot of sort of pulpy, comic booky dudes. I think it's always been there. I think it's really embedded in the DNA of both. Also, like, I don't know if this is just for me too. I think there's like a connection to timing. For comics, it's visual because you're going from panel to panel to panel, and with hip hop, it's auditory. So I think that's also a big connection. I think
Yeah, there's a big payoff when you turn the page and see the like double page spread, or when that beat drops.
Yeah.
And everything just goes like.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to see that about Bodie pieces. I remember seeing them like in New York and then in books about New York graffiti. And to be able to see it in a comic and then to see it on the wall, like life size and bigger than me, it just blew my mind. I was like, oh man, I gotta do that. That is awesome.
So, in what, I guess, are there other, your personal connections to these forms? Are there any specific visual influences that that Aaron and Flo would cite on their own work? Like, I mean, not necessarily like that you're derivative of, but just like things that have visually inspired you to push in that direction. Because the early graffiti artists were all pulling from Baudet, from Frazetta, from Kirby, in the lettering styles. You know, pulling. One of these days, I need to get a couple of old letterers on these panels because that is the combination. And every letterer I've talked to is like, yeah, you know, I don't really know anything about hip hop, and I'm like, oh, but you do. You just don't know it yet.
That's true. I think more of, like, when I look at a comic, it depends on how old or new it is. The color composition, the line work is insane. The balance, the negative and positive, like, I'm always like, with you know, the whole art, the storyboard and how they do it is very much right. The whole thing. I don't know, I love comics. I went to the first cons in the 90s when I was in college, and when the San Diego Comic Con was so small, you can still walk and breathe. Or you can just have your bags and you can do this, and it was okay. It was fine. Anybody can sign your sketchbook, and that's what I really look into comics.
Yeah, I think for me it was definitely motion, like how you could take something that virtually still but make it look like it's flying through the air by like adding a few lines above or below.
Defying gravity too.
Yeah, just like how you make something look like it's floating or it's flying. I think I really, sometimes when I think about painting something in motion, I'll think about old comics. And
The fonts.
yeah, just how they lay it. And I love the combination of the words and the characters together, because just how you can lay the two. And sometimes when they're like unconventionally boxed, some are very kind of this way more British, but then when they do it where it's unconventional, I love that.
I like that, again, because it ties back into the musical side of hip-hop and the breakdancing side of hip-hop, which, again, it's difficult to get breakdancers on these panels. But all these forms are built on that like explosion of energy, whether it's the explosion of color and sound, or that one movement, or the punch being thrown, or that beat dropping.
Well, the New York City Breakers, they used to wear like spandex red suits, so they look like a team of superheroes. And this is going a little way back, but they would wear red, and the Rocksteady crew would wear blue. It would be like this real iconic, like forces of light and darkness fighting each other.
Well, it was this like, it was like Superman whirling, like they're both in the circle, and there's this red and blue tornado.
Yeah, it was.
So I had a question that I just wrote down and I promptly lost it. James, the thing, there's another great missing part of this that you can probably directly speak to, that's something that people have asked me after panels recently, which is there's the element of like skating and graffiti and fashion that tends to get left out of these conversations because skating doesn't, hip-hop doesn't always consider, skating isn't always considered to be a part of hip-hop. It's not always considered to be a part of comic culture, certainly, but it's like smack dab in the middle in combining these influences and in bringing them to really mass American culture. Like, you were seeing graffiti and stuff in skate magazines in the 80s.
Yeah.
As a kid growing up in California and Virginia, long before I was getting hip-hop visual stimulus from things that were referring to it as hip-hop. It was a detail in these skate things.
Right. No, there was a time, I think in the late 80s, where I felt like I was the only graffiti writer in my town. There was no one doing it. And it was kind of lonely, but it was also like, just go to a bridge and paint just for the hell of it. And it was like almost like a novelty in town. And then kids started to pop up who just started painting alongside the stuff I was doing. And then I finally met these kids, and they were all these younger skateboarders. And I thought this is kind of interesting, but street skating kind of came into vogue in the late 80s and early 90s with H Street and Zoo York. And also this whole urban aspect of skateboarding kind of took over the very, shall I say, affluent, vertical and ramp skating that it was in the 80s. It was very much an affluent thing. You had to have a house to build a ramp. Street skating was just this very urban thing. You could just go to a street from anywhere, mostly in urban settings. And I think graffiti carried over into that. And that's how I got into skateboarding, really. And then that's how I got hired at Santa Cruz Skateboards, because I just knew some of these guys. So I kind of came at the other way. And yeah, it was incredible. It was an incredible time. But there was an intersection there for a while. And I think the Beastie Boys video, which one was that? Pass the Mic was the first time I thought, wow, they actually like put it on film. This whole, I mean, there have been other times, but that was like the mass time. I thought, they're putting skateboarders in their videos? A rap video? Oh, this is new, so.
Well, up until that point, despite the visual impact, like every skate video I'd seen had like a metal track or like the hard rock things, and all of a sudden skate videos, like I started hearing rap tracks on skate videos, and I was like, yeah, that's it. There's also the skate element to the few and far stuff, right?
Yeah, half of our collective are skateboarders. So there's the graffiti half and the skateboarding half, and a lot of the girls do both. And it's amazing. They're badass. They'll come bruised up, ready to go. We'll be painting. People are skating around us. It's a really unique experience because it's all women and women supporting women. So it's very different than when you meet men or than when you skate with men. But it's we have about 14 women that are graffiti writers and muralists, and about the same that are skateboarders in our group.
What musical influences would you cite that sort of put these things together in your mind? Because we've talked a lot about the visual ways that hip-hop was brought into like the visual cultures. And as the preeminent musician on the panel, was there anything in particular that really made those things make sense together in your mind from a musical standpoint?
A lot of Persian anthem trance. No, just playing. I'd say I went way over everybody's head. My girlfriend laughed. That's all that matters, right? Okay. I'd say, well, if you want me to cite a group that kind of put it all in perspective, I would have to say Run DMC, because it was, in a lot of different ways, Run DMC put a lot of things in perspective, but they seemed to just, and not that they had like a lot of graph or anything in their artwork on their album covers, it's just the way they presented their lyrics and the way the beats were delivered and the simplification of the way Rick Rubin handled production and Larry Smith and all the other side producers delivered. It felt like graffiti, it felt like comic books, it just all made sense at that point. And the funny thing is they didn't even use a graph or comic book element in their work. It just, for me, it was just like, oh yes, kind of going back to the exaggerated thing again, and kind of going back to the superhero thing too, because they were always like, we're harder than you, it was kind of, today's raps are, a little bit different. It's, for lack of better terminology, a little bit more, maybe more metro. It's just like, it's kind of playing this, I don't know. But back then it was like hard, Grandmaster Flash, that sounds like a comic book character. It's like hard, just one of those things. But I think DMC made it, palatable for me.
Okay. With your own music, since you're largely a producer, it's easy to trace those comic influences with lyricists. And musically, it's a little tougher. Are there any things like beyond simply like throwing in cartoon samples and things any elements of that you use as inspiration when building your own work?
Yeah.
Not to give away your trade secrets.
No, I don't have any secrets. Everything's free. Well, I have a very large children's and comic book collection, and I actually do an all children's toy set on stage when I DJ, with like everything from the 60s monkey that claps, and I use them as a metronome, to the latest, craziest sampling toy. But but comic book records, anything from, Sesame Street stuff. There's a lot of crazy breaks on there, and, there's like a Barry White, I'm Gonna Love You Just a Little Bit More version that, Cookie Monster does on one of his records. There's breaks, and there's samples, and there's a lot of, little nuggets in those records, and sometimes you can get by using those flying underneath the radar of the sample clearance police. Yeah.
There's no sample clearance police in this room, I hope.
You never know, we're at a convention.
Mark, were you ever a graffiti writer?
My entire room had graffiti on it, and it was the blurriest garbage you'd ever see in your entire life. God bless my mom for letting me do that. But I was terrible. I mean, terrible. Like, I went right back to playing drums and making beats and stuff like that, and DJing, of course. But no, I was a terrible graph writer. My tag was dash, and then I moved it from dash to slash, and then I moved it from slash to MP707, and then I just gave up. Yeah, I was whack.
There's something in there. There's a certain passion and sincerity in these works that we respond to in comics and in hip hop, and particularly with when you're speaking specifically not just of the way that these cultures combine, but specifically hip hop in comics. It has at best a pretty checkered history of, people trying to cash in, whether it's Wolfpack or whether it's Archie being like, trying to put a bare hint of legitimacy and modernism into their comics, and so they introduced the two white breakdancers in tracksuits who come in and cause trouble. And then you get things like, the Nine Rings of the Wu-Tang, which is thankfully no longer the first thing people think of when they think of a rap comic. Now that, Mahfoud has gained a lot of exposure, now that James and Kenny have gained a lot of exposure, now that Ed Piskor is out there doing his hip-hop family tree, it's nice that there's really shining examples of these things that, are not clearly just the corporate-driven thing. It's,
There you go, it's the corporate version of it that's always terrible.
So how do you take these things in your work in Warp Zone and Rhyme Travelers in 1985 and make them truthful? Like, you're not marketing them as hip-hop comics necessarily, but the hip-hop fans find them because they speak to them.
Yeah, it's like, rap has done such a dope job of incorporating comics, and it is not reciprocated. It's like, I don't rap, if I was a rapper, I'd make comic bookiest raps I could come up with, but as a comic artist, I struggle to figure out how to get my love for hip-hop in there. I mean,
you come upon the obstacle of there's the obvious elements, which is like you have a breakdancer or a rapper or like a big gold chain,
exactly.
or like it's easy to fall prey to those initial visual cues that certainly can be done well, but also can be a trap.
Yeah, definitely. That stuff can be fun, but I mean, for me, I kind of stumbled on it by accident. The first series of illustrations I did, I was really just goofing off, just mashing up the classic hip hop.
Yeah, but it does with you.
Yeah. So this was just like straight up. I was just trying to draw Thor one night, as one does, and it was like, it was just terrible. It wasn't coming together. It wasn't really me. What I was trying to do, I was just trying to sketch exercise, and I got the music in the background. AWA, Straight Outta Compton comes on, and I do Straight Outta Asgard with Thor and Loki and the Warriors 3 and that whole crew. And it was just like a fever after that. I really didn't expect maybe me and 12 other people to get it, but I was just like, I couldn't stop making these connections in my mind. And that just broke down a real wall for me as far as infusing kind of some humor in it and just having fun with it, not overthinking it, and just making these sort of unconscious connections of how the music and the visuals connect for me. And people, it caught on with people, and then when that happens, you get confidence to like, okay, so maybe I'll just keep going in that direction. So, from that, I'm doing Rhyme Travelers, which is sort of like an interstellar rap group that's, you can gig in space. I'm just trying to have fun with it and just kind of not overthink it and go a little deeper than the obvious, face value.
Right. With those mashups, it's interesting because again, it speaks to that not really reciprocated back and forth between hip hop and comics. I didn't hear anything about that in comic book circles. I heard about it on the OK Player boards, and then I heard about that through the rap circles and the hip hop circles, and all of my friends were like, "Man, did you see these things?" And I was trying to show them to the comics people, and they're like, "Yeah, cool, okay." But it took a good 6-8 months for anybody to pick up on them on the comics end of the spectrum.
I was kind of surprised by that, but yeah, that's how it went. With the rap blogs, cycled through all those and went crazy.
Well, in all fairness, given the comic blogs, it wasn't the Marvel Comics official press release, so
I should have put that on.
you should have. And James, how do you take these? How do you make these things make sense and make them truthful? And Ted also, feel free to jump in on this. To get back to the original question, how do you take these hip hop elements and put them in a comic and make them true and truthful?
I don't think it needs to be deliberate. I think it just happens. There are things you're interested in. I think they'll just come out that way. I think when it's forced, it always kind of seems. I mean, if it's just I think it's something that's just with 1985. I really wanted it just to be, let's just make these real dorky kids live in a small town and get into hip hop, and then just take it from there. And I really wanted it to be as genuine as possible. And I think that's how I thought it would be a little interesting to the average reader. So that was my take on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just little things. I wear Adidas, so my characters wear Adidas. I wear hoodies, so my characters wear hoodies. It's little things that to me are just normal, I guess, but maybe not in the regular comics world. Also, my comics online, if you check it out, www.edgarthewarplay.com, I've got a soundtrack by this dude, Computer J, Jack Progresso, and some from the Milky Way. So it's I'm striving to make it, just connected any way possible. For me, it's like a soundtrack, instead of John Williams, I got Computer J. That's, to me, that's what it sounds like in my mind. So, that's what I want to put out there.
And James, you actually released comics with soundtracks as well, right?
Yes. Yeah. Suggested soundtrack.
Yeah. Each issue of 1985 comes with that. So, cool. We're getting close to the end. Are there any questions from the audience?
First, I just like to introduce myself.
Or a song or a blog or whatever it is that your focus is on. You can spend time on that one if you know it has some fire underneath it. But once you're finished, start the next thing. Don't give your mind time to idle. Get right into the next thing and keep shooting at the target. People are into quantity right now. That's just been my experience lately. You just got to constantly put things out, and as soon as you leave for a little while, they forget you. You got to stay right in their face.
Like for Ted, when you write your comments.
This panel has been retweeted many, many times, but the last article I wrote got all of 5 hits from Twitter and over 5,000 just from Facebook over the course of the day. There's no regularity. Don't focus all your energy in one place. Just put it out there, cross-post, and keep working at it. Is there a next question?
Aaron Yoshi, I think, on Twitter, @_ on Instagram, Aaron Yoshi. And I also am the executive director of the Estria Foundation. I have postcards here if you want to see some of our murals. We have international mural projects we're working on, a national graffiti competition, and thank you very much.
We're also repping Few and Far Crew, all girl, and you can go into fewandfarwomen.com. Also on Instagram, Few and Far Women. And my website is gloriamuriel.com, and then you can see their Facebook and all the links, and I got also some bookmarks to give. And thank you. Thanks for having
me. Kenny Kyle on Twitter, tailstosuffice.com. On the internet, you can see samples of all my work and read some comics and stuff.
James Rotano, 1985.com. The site is very 2007 looking. I apologize. I'm working on it, but nevertheless, all the info is there. You can buy the books and check it out. And yeah, that's about it.
DJ Newmark, you can catch me at unclenew.com or on Twitter as DJ Newmark or Facebook as DJ Newmark. Thanks for having me.
It's Ted Lange. It's www.enterthewarpzone.com and hellotedward.tumblr.com and at TWL4 on Twitter. That's TNT Publishing. That's SP115.
Great.
And thank you for having me.
Cool. We're at fieldmagazine.com. We'll be